John, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
So, can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
So my name is John Pizzuro. I am retired from the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, which is acronym of called ICAC, from the New Jersey State Police. Spent 25 years there, and now I am the CEO of Raven, which is the first of its kind lobbying organization for law enforcement technology to actually change a lot of the funding mechanisms and legislation that's happening today that we're all impacted by.
Awesome. How did you get into the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force when you were in law enforcement?
Well, it's one of those things where people get transferred for various reasons. So I got transferred there as the commander back in 2014, 2015, in that time range. And I ended up taking over the task force, and that task force was responsible for all the cyber trafficking, child exploitation cases in the U.S. or New Jersey for that point.
Mm-hmm. And so what? How did you get appointed? Was it something that you wanted to do, or was it because of casework you had done outside of that division previously?
Well, I just got put there, transferred as people got transferred around. But what happens is I had spent 5 years in organized crime, narcotics, corruption. But when I got there, it became probably the most purposeful thing that I've ever done before. So much so that I'm still in it today.
Mm-hmm. That says a lot about how passionate you are about this field.
I mean, what's more noble than trying to protect a child, right?
Yeah, and I imagine it kind of the advice that you give and the situations have changed a lot in the last 20 years. I know that when I was a kid, the and maybe it's more true now than it was then. The whole stranger danger, when the reality was it really wasn't strangers perpetrating a lot of the crimes against kids, and now has it flipped the other way?
Well, think about it. We text a stranger to get in a car with them,
Yeah.
right? So it's completely changed. Technology has really changed, right? So you taught 2008. There's what, on average, one computer per household.
Yeah.
I think when I was leaving, we would do a search warrant, and you're talking about there's 20 internet-capable devices because there's laptops, there's phones, there's heck, now your refrigerator, your Nest. I mean, really, technology has impacted, but the thing that hasn't is so much as behavior. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand. The apps and technology will change, but what has really changed in the last 20 years is the behavior as a result of that technology.
So let's talk about that. What was the behavior previously, and how has it changed over the years?
Well, right now, you even ask the CDC, they talk about cell phone addiction, right? So today, we are dopamine dependent. And meaning is that it's likes, followers, and views. And because of that, it's really changed where we get our attention and how easily we get duped. So, for example, I talk a lot about social engineering. And if I told you right now, right, if you were sitting and an earthquake started, and you would jump for cover automatically.
Yeah.
But in your own house, you're not worried about anything when you're talking to someone online. And that's because your fear, flight, and freeze center of your amygdala of your brain is not activated. So that is where today more people are getting scammed. And it's just not just children. You can go to adult fraud, and you can go to any of those aspects, but it's because we're in a safe environment. So when you're in a safe environment, you don't tend to believe that something bad's going to happen.
It's my home is a safe place, and by extension, in a weird way, the internet is now a safe place.
Correct.
Oh, that's an awful thought.
Yeah, and you're more trusting, right? So, and if you talk to neuroscientists, and when you look at something and you look at an image all the time, you believe it. And that's why, from a political perspective, we've become so polarized, is because ads basically target what we like. I was just talking to, it was funny. I had a phone conversation with someone before the podcast, and they were talking about the destabilization of the US dollar. So as I scroll on social media, the first ad I see is about the US dollar being destabilized. So there you go, right?
And a little bit of positive reinforcement.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So now, yeah.
So what, kind of let's talk about some of those behaviors. What are some of the behaviors that have changed? Obviously, we're more trusting of our devices now than when we were, 10 or 20 years ago. But how has the behavior changed in the sense of like predators and kids being targeted?
Well, there's a couple things. One is, so a lot of predators and offenders, what they do is they manipulate through language. And what do I mean by language? So, Chris, what's your favorite rock band or favorite music?
Oh, let's just say it's you two, even though it's not, because I can think of it off the top of my head.
All right. All right. I love you too, right? So I'm going to say is like we can go back in written words and you say, hey, you know what? I just listened to Ordinary Love, new track by U2. And I'm like, Ordinary Love, really? U2? That's my favorite band as well. What happens is, what do we like to talk about most?
Things that we like.
And ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is good offenders, and this is social engineering 101 in general, what they tend to do is they will actually mimic someone's language. So when I'm reading something, what do I see? I see the exact language repeated back at me. Wow, this person is just like me. Now, all of a sudden, my trust is down. They repeat the same language, it's the same phrases. And now I want to believe that. And because all my self esteem and popularity comes from social media and the likes, followers, and views, I'm hooked. It's that simple.
Was it that way 20 years ago with kids being groomed by their coaches and things like that, or is that kind of a really change in the way that the grooming has changed?
It's changed because of the reliance on technology. If you're talking about grooming 20 years ago, obviously you go to the ice cream and you talk to the actual park. But think about this, and this is what I tell a lot of people. All right, your child right now who's playing Fortnite or Roblox, and they might be 12, and they're playing with a 40-year-old. If you went to a neighborhood and you went to a playground and you saw a 40-year-old approach your 12-year-old, what would you think, right?
Yeah.
But you're at home, you don't see it.
So I don't necessarily want to jump into the legislation yet. I think we have a lot of questions, but I want to come back to the question of, do the platforms have a responsibility in identifying who's using their platforms to other people? Let's come back to that, because I think that probably ties in a little bit with stuff we want to talk about later on.
Yep. So you want so like when you talk about the platforms, I was asked when I testified in the Senate Judiciary Committee in February. I was asked this question: are social media companies doing enough? And my response was, they don't do anything. Just it was one of those responses. But the reality is, most of the companies they have limited moderation, right? I start an app company tomorrow. I have 2 or 3 people. So I don't have the ability to moderate. So then there's scanning. Then there's the people on their platform. The reality is, I could be whoever I want with any device I want and join whatever I want. So a 6-year-old can pretend to be a 24-year-old. A 24-year-old can be a 6-year-old, and there is no identity checks or age verification checks.
Mm-hmm. And so is that one of the things that you are pushing for through your lobbying efforts?
So one of the challenges is the privacy. Like, everyone's worried about privacy.
Yeah.
And, the thing is with law enforcement, I could guarantee you that Google and Amazon Web Services and Meta, for that case, know more about you than law enforcement can ever intrude on, right?
Yeah.
So I think for a law enforcement perspective, we want to have that ability. We want something where it's hard. We respect privacy. I don't care what anyone else does, but how do we protect children? And I think to have something along those lines where we could, how do you put it, at least have the ability to where I'll use Tinder, for example, that if I'm 13, that even if I lie and say I'm 18, that Tinder knows that individual isn't 18. So without geolocation, without any of the other parameters. So we're just looking to protect children more. But everyone is on the platforms, but the platforms don't nearly do enough.
Yeah. Do you see AI as being something that will help in the long run in terms of if AI is monitoring conversations, it can kind of see this stuff and recognize the patterns?
So AI, all right. So not to agree a lot with Elon
Mhm.
Musk here with AI, but there's a lot that we don't know about AI, and
Yeah.
honestly, there has to be regulation right now with AI. A lot of challenges with that, especially people using AI to actually even groom. Because let's face it, if I can download a child's history, what's better than to have the AI program just mimic rather than me
Yeah.
mimic it? So again, it's like one of those things where technology has its uses, but then how is it regulated? How is it introduced? So, but from a scanning mechanism, we got end-to-end encryption now, and a lot of platforms. Think about this. This is last year there were 32 million cyber tips from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. 32
Wow.
million. Okay. Do you know how many of them came from Apple?
4.
10.
Oh,
So if how many people have an iOS device?
I think there's about a billion out there.
Right? Like if I went and asked, every time I ask, 60 to 70% of the people that raised their hands have an Apple device.
Yeah.
We're not getting tips from them, right? Because again, they are locking everything down from an end-to-end encryption. If we don't know what's happening on the platform, it's not happening. But the reality is there's more cases of teen suicide through sextortion, victimization today. So the reality is that again, these platforms who make billions and billions of dollars, and by the way, they actually they hire lobbyists at trillions of dollars, millions of dollars to go in and lobby for them. So the question is, where is the duty to care? And I
Yeah.
think I think everything's a balance.
And I think that's the hard thing for people to understand, that there's in all these things there's always going to be a balance that has to be achieved. You can't have absolute privacy and then have good law enforcement. You can't have, but if you have 100, the law enforcement doing everything, then you lose privacy. There's a balance that has to be played.
So, and I think that's what ultimately, you try to do. So, if we had a backdoor for end-to-end encryption, and then we knew a child from being scanned was in there, then the privacy people would be like, well, then my my information isn't safe.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things where it's tough because I'm asked a lot about Section 230, which is liability. So when you take a look at some of these platforms, um, you have mothers and fathers that are imploring Congress and the Senate because their child committed suicide, yet the current law doesn't allow for any lawsuits or regarding that use of social media by those children that committed suicide. So again, how do you come up with a problem? And I think today we're so polarized is you have two groups, but ultimately, instead of complaining, can't we come up with a solution? So I
Yeah.
think that's why kind of Raven exists.
Is it that you find that people either were all one way or were all the other way, when the realistic, 90, 80% of Americans, it's not black or white, it's gray for most of us.
Yes. So, and maybe that's why, because I'm a Libra, I guess, because I got the scales or whatever. So I see both sides and I tend to I'm down the middle. I could see both, but there's a saying, you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right?
Yep.
But if we don't do anything, then everyone's going to suffer. So I'd rather do something at least good in the right direction. And then look, hopefully something like that we're able to implement to help.
So let's talk about like what we could do to help. Let's talk about what should be happening on outside of the platforms first, and then what should be happening, on platforms or with technology. If we can split that, because I know that there is, hopefully there are people involved in children's lives who can have conversations and can see things. What should they be doing? What kind of conversations should they be having to try to help the kids there, and then let's talk about on the technology side or the intervention side.
All right, so let's talk about so we're talking about children first. Parents need to have conversations with their children, right? They understand technology, and it drives me insane every time I go to a restaurant and I see someone hand a phone to a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
But they know that system better than the adult does already at 2. All right. So I think it starts with an early conversation. I think open communication is really important. I think we don't talk about how offenders and predators actually will try to victimize children and how to groom them.
Yeah.
Like I was talking about language before. So I think it starts there. And it starts at an early age. If you're talking to your child when they're 12 or 13, it's already too late, because I like to say this, a couple years back, I went on the beach and I'm walking on the beach, and this is when TikTok just started. And there's 67 people on the beach. All the kids are on their phone. It's 80 degrees and sunny out. There's 12 TikToks, and then there's a 4-year-old who can't find their parents.
Yeah.
So if I could take a microcosm of that and blow it up. So when you talk about it, I think that's where that starts. And that's, the preventative piece at home. I think with that, you need it to be implemented in school. We talk about vaping, right? We talk about drugs and weed and, whatever, alcohol or teen pregnancy. But why aren't we talking about social media and the impacts there? Why isn't that part of the health class? But like at 4th grade or 3rd grade, the long-term impacts of that, right? Yeah. So I think that's what I would talk about on the preventative side.
Do you know why it's not, what's your position on why it's not being taught as part of education?
Well, part of it is the subject matter. No one wants to talk about child exploitation in general. So just to give you a break, trafficking is 1% in comparison of the problem to child exploitation. All you have to do is take a look at the tips from the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. So, but the challenge becomes no one wants to talk about it because your 60-year-old or 7-year-old could be victimized.
Yeah.
The other thing is that they've implemented trafficking into the schools a little bit more, but that is based on the movie Taken from Liam Neeson, where, it just that and the way it got marketed. And I'm not saying trafficking doesn't exist or it's not a problem, but it's taking up that space to, honestly, if I was able to help children at a younger age, the likelihood of them becoming a trafficking victim and becoming a narcotics user, opiate user, lessens, right? So I think what people don't understand, if I'm 6 years old and an offender made me do something sexual and I sent that image, I have been assaulted and I'm going to be impacted. And then later on, I'm traumatized there. And that leads to those other coping mechanisms and behaviors.
So really it's, having age appropriate conversations way early, as opposed to, hey, you're 16 now, you should be careful about sending photos.
Yeah. So, my son will be on the couch for the wrong reasons, right? So he's 18 now, but when he was 12, he was chatting with someone online. He was playing Fortnite, and I'm like, who are you talking to? Don't worry about it. I said, no, who are you talking to? Don't worry about it. I said, Colin, who are you talking to? He says, I don't know. Some guy just started asking me questions. I said, hey, you're a predator. So he'll be on couch for the other reasons of not trusting anyone. But,
I mean, that you've done something right when he's looking at people that he doesn't know as a potential predator. Hopefully he's not, paranoid and afraid of everybody, but
yeah. So, there's the balance.
Yeah, there's the balance. Yeah. And I think it's, I think with any of these topics, when we as adults are uncomfortable talking about it, the concept of having productive discussions with kids about it is, we're afraid of it. We hope if we don't talk about it, it'll go away. It won't happen.
Yeah. And here's the other thing. The parents are so addicted to their own devices that they don't have time. It's kind of like, and I love Netflix, right? You start binge watching something, it goes from one episode to another, to another, to another. Everything. Matter of fact, this is a great If people can Google this, Sean Parker, Axios, in 2017, he did an interview. And in the interview, he said that, hey, we wanted to consume as much as your time as possible as a former mind hacker. And I'm paraphrasing a little, but we knew what we were doing, that we would give you a hit of dopamine and get as much attention as possible. We knew that, and we did it anyway. Yeah. So it's a really important aspect to understand and that goes for all of us. You know, if you put a couple TV shows on right now and I'm sitting there, next thing I know, I'm like, oh my God, it's 2:00 in the morning.
Yeah. You know, how much of the problem is this us kind of being addicted to our devices and not being aware of what's going on, and that we're viewing the device, our relationship with the device, as opposed to the relationship with the people beyond the device, if that makes sense.
So it comes down to, I think it's that device, that relationship with that device. It's that need for constant self-esteem or constant feedback. And I think that's where it really starts, right? So instant gratification. Think about it. I could find anything that I want out. Like someone asked me, hey, how old this actor was. And I'm like, hey, how old is Marissa Tomei? Marissa Tomei is 57 years old. So my point is that you just take a look. You take a look wherever you go. Airplanes. Go sit on an airplane. Like you sit there, everyone is just mindlessly scrolling, right? So no one's reading books anymore, right? No one's meditating or that sort of thing. But I think that's where that constant attention. And what happens is it takes you a while. You become so dopamine dependent, you need more and more and more and more.
So are the predators aware of this, or that they're thinking, hey, I've done the research, I'm giving dopamine hits to the people I'm trying to take advantage of, or is this just kind of ingrained in how kind of under the surface and they don't even realize they're doing this?
So I think there's some extent to that, but I'll give you the dark net, right? There's this board community on the dark net, and it was How to Seduce a 4-Year-Old that's been read 55,000 times. Oh. All right. Again, underage thoughts on oral sex from 0 to 2-year-olds, read 17,000 times. So the point is that there are communities where people share techniques. And if you look at the dark net and Tor, you'll see a lot of that. And again, they're not even trading the images, but it's like best practices. And what'll happen is I'll give a presentation somewhere about what to do, and the next thing I know, that's in the Tor community, and they're saying, "Hey, let's change our behavior here because they're looking over here." Mm.
So, kind of with a lot of things, it's a cat and mouse game.
Yeah, and you're talking about and I'll give you here's a perfect example. So people today, there's these, you remember Napster in the day, right? Mm-hmm. So like peer-to-peer networks. So, right now there's 100,000 people that have traded IP addresses in the US over the last 90 days that have distributed and shared rape and toddler sexual abuse videos. Oh. All right. There's only 728 being worked right now. Just to give you an extra ad. So Dr. Michael Burke did this study called the Buntner study. And in those studies, he found that each one of those 100,000 people, 50 to 85% of them are hands-on offenders, with the average victims between 10 and 13. So if I just do that and extrapolate that number in half, there's 450,000 victims of child sexual abuse in the U.S. that we haven't even got to.
Oh, wow. And what, 85,000 perpetrators, active perpetrators.
So, and that's part of why kind of where Raven comes in and Raven exists is because, like, funding, for example, the ICAC task force that does a lot of these investigations, 61 task forces only get $33 million. Yet 33 HIDTA task forces get $596 million, high intensity drug trafficking. Mm-hmm. So they don't have the money, they don't have the resources, they don't have the laws, and as a result, we're at a point where there's more child victimization now than there's ever been in the entire point anytime during our history.
It is part of the uh, difficulty that internet crimes are more likely cross jurisdictional, cross state borders, cities, countries, whereas if you have your drug trafficking, well, we know the guy has to come in our town to deliver the drugs.
Well, here's the interesting thing about that. The ICAC task force has 61 task forces throughout the US. So we work conjointly. So we would have 4 meetings per year where we would sit and we would actually talk. So I might get a call from South Dakota ICAC and say, "Hey, I got this suspect. They're talking to this victim," and then we would move the victim. So it's probably the best run, most efficient task force out of any task forces in the U.S. So yeah,
in terms of like great cooperation between groups.
Yeah, because everyone, you have federal partners, state partners, local partners. There's training mechanisms together, conferences together. So that's what makes and they do over 90% of all the child exploitation cases in the U.S.
Wow. One group of one.
Yeah. So now, but it's like New Jersey ICAC was run by the New Jersey State Police, but I had every prosecutor's office. We had 71 agencies that were part of the task force and did some part of that work. And each state is similar to that. Like Texas has 3 ICACs. California has 5 ICACs because of the population and the size of the state.
Gotcha. And they're way understaffed, way underfunded, way under resourced.
Think about this. 2008, right, was the Protect Our Children Act. That was what started the ICAC task force. In 2008, they were authorized at 60 million. They've never received the 60 million. It's 2024. And at that time, there was 1 computer per household. Since then, cyber tips have gone up 2,800%, yet funding has only gone up 30%.
Yeah. Major shortfall.
And one of the things is, and you know this too, from a technology standpoint, it costs money to investigate. So if I want to, for example, use software like magnet software, Axiom, that's $6,500. If I want to use a gray key, it's $80,000. If I want to use, all that adds up, but the tools have changed, right? Before it was just 1 license and it was small software and it was a computer. But now we got like terabyte iPhones. You know how long it takes to go through that data?
Yeah. Way more time consuming, resource consumption.
And then storage. What do we? So that's the other thing, is that we have local servers, but again, we're talking about cloud storage too, because the amount of digital evidence. So I think that's what we're like Raven for us is, it's just the funding mechanism, it's the technology mechanism, it's holding the tech companies accountable, and just having some robust legislation in order to protect things.
So let's talk about it. What are the legislative changes and the funding changes that you want to see start to take place, not just domestically, but internationally?
So one of the things, like you said, internationally, the internet's everywhere, right? So the same problems are in Australia and England are here in the US. So one of the things that we want is laws that'll protect children better. For example, age identification or identity verification without infringing on some type of privacy. So we have one act that we'll call the Parental Empowerment Act, that we want to make sure that we can at least protect kids on their devices. That's probably one. Number 2 is like probably the reauthorization of the Protect Our Children Act of 2008, which we can go from funding from 33 million to hopefully in the 400s of million. But also add some more protective fixes. So, for example, when the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, when they get cyber tips, they get certain pieces of information, because Meta might send 3 pieces of information. Snapchat might send 4. So law enforcement is already behind the curve because of whether it be screen names, email addresses, geolocation. So we want to modernize the amount of data.
Mhm.
Everyone should be sending data. So, for example, NECMEC will ask you, hey, we need you to provide 30 points of data. Well, some only give you 2 or 3, and we complied.
Yeah.
So that it's voluntary compliance. And I think we're at a point where it can't be voluntary anymore.
Mhm.
So,
So what are some of the hurdles that you're facing in trying to get legislation and funding?
all right. So a couple things is as so the Republicans have the House, the Democrats have the Senate. One of the major tenets is spending, right? Because spending in government programs is high. So again, that's an argument to have, and just say, hey, this is where money needs to be put in this bucket, and this is why. And one of the things we can do is we can articulate it and explain, every level of it. So the other thing is one good thing out of that Senate Judiciary hearing, it is a bipartisan issue.
Mhm.
So whether you're a Democrat or Republican, I don't know how you cannot argue to save children.
Yeah.
The challenge comes on how to do it. Everyone agrees we should do it,
Yeah.
but then the devil is in the details, because people and other organizations might want to take certain things out of those bills that impact them. And that is where a lot of time has to be spent educating and ensuring that those bills get to a committee and get passed.
Where are you seeing the most common ground between the different sides of the political spectrum, and where are you seeing the largest disagreements?
All right, probably the largest disagreement right now probably would be around 230, is because do we hold all these tech companies liable, or do we give them some, immunity? So I think that's part of it, because it's a broader scope. I think that's where you get privacy advocates. So I think the challenge is that privacy has already had the loudest voice there, and I don't think they've heard from this side,
Mhm.
basically. So I think that's probably the biggest hurdle in there when we talk about that. Then we're talking about regulation. Look, if we regulate someone in a free capitalism society, then that goes against kind of what we're doing. But I think, again, we have to bear some responsibility. So I think that is going to be the biggest fight going on.
Mhm.
But we got to find a compromise or something that would do both.
Is that some of the challenges, that when you start talking about Section 230, you either have, it's enshrined, we can't touch it, and then the other side is we need to get rid of it
Burn it.
entirely, as
Yes.
opposed to how do we modify this in a way that makes sense?
Yes, those are your two different extremes, right? So that's what makes it challenging. And the challenge is that, Chris, we can have a bill, and the larger the bill, the more likely someone's going to take issue with something in those bills.
Yeah.
So now I am not a professional lobbyist, right? So we're just going and advocating for what we do. So I go in, and it's amazing the amount of groups that want their own little signature stamp. They want this taking out. So, and I'm like, wow, now I understand why it's so hard to pass something.
Yeah. Everybody wants their fingerprint on some little piece of the pie.
Well, do you remember, you're old enough to know Schoolhouse Rocks, right?
Yep.
Remember the video, What's a Bill and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what I'm really disappointed in is that it's completely wrong. Everything I learned in that bill is completely wrong.
Yeah, yeah. It's a lot of politicking now, and less about the goal. Unfortunately, is what it appears to be from a layman's perspective.
The good news is that there is a little bit of a groundswell, and at least we've talked to 40 legislative staff and 40 different legislators in the last 3 months alone. And everyone's in agreement. It's just, I think it's the how. I think that's going to be the challenging part. So, but at least we're there, because if it was any other issue, forget it.
Yeah, everybody has a certain amount of common ground on we need to do what's in best interest of children, versus, well, that's a only 5% of the people in the country care about that issue. We can't tackle that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there an easier front on the money side and the funding side?
All right. So the funding side, the Democrats generally will fund more, but now you're talking about fiscal Republicans that really want to watch every penny.
Yeah.
So I think that becomes hard because of the funding and the amount of our debt. So if you just take us as a country and you look at our debt and you look at the money that we're spending, and you look at our deficit, I think that becomes problematic. So that becomes the argument. And what's going to happen is that in order, they're not going to create more programs with more money and more spending. They're going to have to take it from other places.
Yeah.
So then that's where it really becomes dicier. I think in this issue, if we can articulate things the way we could show, I'm naive. You know what? I think I got an argument. Maybe that's why I'm still doing this, right? So that I still can make a difference.
Is it easier on the local and the state side as opposed to the federal side when it comes to both legislation and funding?
So yes and no. Federally, it's easier to talk to people because that process. The challenge is with states, every process is different and every state is different, right? So, but ultimately, the state needs to pony up. They can't just rely on the federal government all the time, too, right? So it should be in conjunction that where, for example, well, I'll use New Jersey as an example. So New Jersey had $600,000 in their ICAC program, which isn't even enough to buy, one or two tools, and that's it. So realistically, they should have at least 2 million federally, but then the state should be kicking in another million, or 1.5, and then maybe another 500,000. So the state should be maybe even matching something specifically, because I'll give you some stats. In New Jersey, in 2015, we had like 120 arrests, which were like, oh my God, this is horrible. In 2019, we had 423 arrests.
Ooh, wow.
All right. So when we talk about the amount of offenders and victims in this state, there are kids. So I think the challenge is that there's money all these other places, and when you come down to money, people fight tooth and nail for that existence over that money. So that's what makes it difficult.
Yeah, and that will always be the challenge. There's always more programs than money, whether it's local, state, federal, international level. There's always more.
And
more need than funds. Yeah.
And what gets cut first is victim services. So advocacy centers, child advocacy centers, they do all the victim care, forensic interviewing. They get cut for anyone else. So, you're talking about, I would love to have a study where we talk about the value of a child, right? So if you have a child that's victimized, what is that harm to that child? Or better yet, the U.S., of that traumatization, what does it incur to their value in society and the country in general, right? Had that not happened.
Yeah. And that's I've seen studies like that, or the discussion of studies like that, and the fear is, well, now you're placing the fear is now you're placing a financial value on somebody's life, and we shouldn't be valuing people's lives in terms of money. But there is definitely an impact to society as a whole.
Yeah, I mean,
when someone's gone through a traumatic event.
Yeah. So how many doctors did we lose? How many lawyers did we lose? How many engineers did we lose? How many valuable people that could have changed the way we grew as a country? So I think those are things that you look at. But the challenge with research is every researcher I ever saw just wants to go from research project to research project. It's not enough money. But at some point, it's kind of like it's funny because like I teach college, part-time, and you have the career educator that wants to talk about theory all the time. At some point, there's got to be some action to that theory. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
So that's a good segue. So if people want to get involved and people want to help move legislation forward or help the lobbying event, help the advocacy, what can they do?
So you can go to www.raven.us. It's very easy. My email, by the way, is jp@raven.us. So we'll make it nice and simple. But there are things that, obviously donation, funding, your legislators, have talk with your legislators. If you have an event where you need support in that town, or you need someone to talk to the elected members, we're more than happy to do that, to provide that expertise.
Provide the who to talk to, how to talk to them, the talking
Yeah,
points.
and ultimately, you're a vote.
Yeah.
So if enough of you are want something done, well, the last thing I checked is people that get elected want to stay elected.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Take this issue seriously, or I will not vote for you again.
yes,
And that's where I think it comes down to that. This is my personal soapbox is voting people not by which party they're a part of, but by the values and the things that they say they're going to do. And if they don't do it, you replace them with somebody else who will.
yeah, no, and I think that's what we're trying to do, Chris. Is just we want accountability, right? We want people to be accountable, and for too long, no one's been accountable, and that goes from the tech companies, and that goes from the status quo. The status quo has been the same for this crime type since 2008. Nothing has changed. So that's why we created Raven. I mean, look, we're all part-time. So Raven's made up of 9 retired internet crimes against children commanders, a policy expert, Dr. Michael Burke. So we have people that have dedicated their life to us. We don't personally benefit from this.
Yeah.
You know, we're not advocating for us. And most of our children are grown at this point, but we started this and we just kind of want to move the needle. And it's John Matson, who's the president of our board. When I first called him about this, he said, "John, if not us, who? And if not now, when?"
Yeah. And that's always the call. So I think, are there any other particular resources you want to make sure that we mention before we wrap up today?
If you are looking for any education courses, you can go to johnpizzuro.com. I do all child exploitation, the dark net, grooming, anything along those lines. If you need someone to come in and speak about that to your institution or organization. So I teach a lot of that. But other than that, no, I appreciate your time.
Okay, John, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today. I really appreciate your mission post work life.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
All right.